The section actually starts off with a bit of a debunking of a Mythbusters episode, but we're going to bypass that and get on into the meat of the technical aspects of the spacesuits. Once again, the photographs are excellent, so by all means, head over to that website and check out the photographs that go along with the article. So let's jump right in. Wagging the Moondoggie, Part 9. During the flight of Gemini 7, the crew will remove their lightweight spacesuits and fly in their underwear. James V. Corial Jr., the head of the Gemini Support Office. There's no question in our minds. The only way to fire these things is without pressure suits. I'm convinced we could run the whole works without suits. All we need is a suit for re-entry and emergency stored on board somewhere. Astronaut Frank Borman in voice transmissions from the Gemini 7 capsule. In the early 1960s, as NASA began training astronauts to meet President Kennedy's challenge, it realized that there was one key area of expertise that it knew nothing about. Nobody knew how to build a spacesuit that would enable a human being to survive in the lethal lunar environment. So begins Moon Machines, the spacesuit. As previously noted, Alan Shepard had ridden the first manned Mercury capsule into suborbit just before Kennedy's announcement. The Mercury program, launched in 1959, just after the formation of NASA, was America's first space program. The suits used for that program were, according to both NASA and the talking heads on the Science Channel, redundant. The capsules provided the astronauts with their first line of defense. The suits were only an emergency backup that no one was sure would even work. But now, with Kennedy's commitment to the Apollo program, our astronauts are going to need suits that provided their first and only line of defense. NASA didn't yet have suits that could operate off the ship's life support systems through umbilical cords, such as would be needed to perform spacewalks, and now it needed suits capable of providing fully independent life support. Starting essentially from scratch, NASA was going to have to come up with one of the most technologically advanced spacesuits ever conceived, and was going to have to do it very quickly. 8 companies reportedly submitted proposals to NASA for consideration. Almost all were companies that were known within the aerospace industry. One, however, was known for its work in somewhat different field of endeavor. The International Latex Corporation was best known for the manufacture of Playtex bras and girdles. Improbably enough, though, it would soon be adding Apollo spacesuits to its product line. Wikipedia, it should be noted, contains a much different version of events than what was provided by Moon Machines, including a claim that ILC began designing spacesuits as early as 1955. The version provided by the Science Channel, however, came directly from the people who were involved in the project, and the company's own promotional material hold that, quote, ILC started designing suits in 1961, started making test and prototype suits in 1964, and started delivering suits for use by Apollo astronauts in 1966. In April 1962, NASA awarded the Apollo spacesuit contract to ILC. Hamilton Standard, a company known for manufacturing aircraft propellers, was assigned to oversee the project. ILC quickly put its bra and girdle seamstresses to work cutting and sewing Apollo spacesuits. Meanwhile, Hamilton Standard went to work designing and building the life support packs, known as PLSS units, or portable life support systems. Amazingly enough, the first spacesuits to roll off the line were delivered to NASA for testing in 1963. ILC had designed and built the suits in just over a year. Unfortunately, though, they had a major flaw. Astronauts testing them quickly overheated in the Florida sun, which is roughly 160 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than the surface of the moon. NASA issued an ultimatum to Hamilton Standard: solve the cooling problem and do it immediately, or the contract would be canceled. The solution was to design a water-cooled undergarment. By early 1964, just 2 years after the awarding of the contract, the redesigned suits were being shipped to NASA for testing. NASA, however, was still not impressed with what Hamilton and ILC had come up with. The suits were deemed to be too heavy, extremely difficult to move around in, and intensely uncomfortable to wear, even for short durations. In the fall of 1964, NASA canceled the contracts with both ILC and Hamilton Standard. With just 5 years left to fulfill Kennedy's dream, NASA had no working spacesuits and no contract with anyone to design and build working spacesuits. After briefly experimenting with the so-called hard suits, NASA decided in the spring of 1965 to reopen the bidding on the spacesuit contract. Both Hamilton and ILC again submitted proposals, and again the contract was awarded to the makers of Playtex bras. Hamilton was awarded a separate contract to design and build the life support packs. Just weeks after NASA awarded those contracts, Gemini astronaut Ed White allegedly became the first American to perform a spacewalk, despite the fact that NASA did not yet appear to have a suit that would allow for such a maneuver. Nevertheless, on June 3, 1965, White allegedly performed a successful 22-minute EVA, extravehicular activity in NASA jargon, which was yet another "we can do it too" response to the Soviet Union's first spacewalk. As astronaut Gene Cernan recalled, Leonov's spacewalk on March 18, 1965 shocked a lot of people. It caught us totally unexpected, and we were just barely flying in space in our own little capsules. They weren't even big enough to be called spaceships. Indeed, the United States hadn't yet gotten the first two-man capsule into space. The Mercury program, which had ended nearly 2 years earlier, had only gotten 4 single-occupancy capsules into orbit. NASA's plan had been to attempt a spacewalk on the fourth manned Gemini flight, and it had not yet gotten the first Gemini capsule off the ground. NASA's plan apparently changed rather abruptly, and a few days before the launch of Gemini 4, which was only the second manned Gemini mission, the first having completed just 3 orbits, it was announced that White would be performing an EVA while Jim McDivitt piloted the capsule. According to astronaut Frank Borman, NASA scrambled around kind of hurriedly and, in my estimation, without a great deal of safety factor, had Ed go EVA on Gemini 4. As McDivitt recalled, our EVA was very confidential at the time. We had not announced we were going to do this, and we were all doing all of our training at night, and only a group of maybe 30 or 40 people even knew that we were going to try it. Translated from NASA speak, what that very likely means is that a select group worked covertly with the astronauts to fake the spacewalk footage prior to the launch of Gemini 4. Notably, NASA did not attempt the maneuver again for an entire year, until June 3, 1966, despite the fact that 4 Gemini capsules were launched during the intervening year, and those 4 spent a combined total of 23 days in low Earth orbit. Yet none of those 4 crews, it would appear, had time to practice spacewalking, even though practicing and perfecting EVAs was one of the primary goals of the Gemini program. Not even Frank Borman and Jim Lovell, who spent nearly 2 weeks orbiting Earth in a tiny capsule with virtually nothing to do for the majority of their mission, had time to perform a spacewalk. It was not until Gemini 9 that NASA attempted to duplicate White's alleged performance. But that second spacewalk by Gene Cernan was by all accounts a complete failure that almost cost Cernan his life. Problems began almost immediately, with Cernan's heart rate at times soaring as high as 170. His visor became fogged, leaving him blinded and disoriented. His breathing was labored and he was sweating profusely. Doctors on the ground monitoring the situation feared he would not make it back alive, and he would have to be cut loose. The next 2 EVA attempts by Michael Collins aboard Gemini 10 and Richard Gordon aboard Gemini 11 were failures as well. As 1966 was drawing to a close, 3 astronauts in a row had failed to replicate what Ed White had supposedly easily accomplished over a year earlier. But then, in November 1966, a year and a half after White's alleged spacewalk, none other than Buzz Aldrin performed a wildly successful EVA during the Gemini 12 mission. Aldrin had come through just in time. Gemini 12 was the last Gemini mission. In sum, the Gemini program resulted in 1 faked EVA, 3 failed EVAs, and 1 presumably successful EVA. Even if we give the agency every benefit of the doubt, the record would be 3 failures and only 2 successes. And with that impressive record, we're ready to send our guys off on a series of EVAs of a complexity that remains unmatched to this day. Curiously, the footage of White's alleged spacewalk is characterized by the very same slow-motion photographic technique later employed on the alleged moon missions. The footage released by the Soviets of Leonov's EVA, on the other hand, does not appear to be slowed down. The logical conclusion to draw, of course, is that moving in slow motion in space is more of a matter of culture than science. The final spacesuits sent by ILC to NASA were supposedly composed of 3 layers: the water-cooled undergarment, the pressurized inner suit that featured flexible bellows joints, and a white outer covering made of experimental fabric known as beta cloth. The bra and girdle manufacturer, which I'm guessing must have had a large engineering division, designed and built the entire integrated suit, including the helmet and visor, and the specially designed boots and gloves. The Apollo spacesuits supposedly weighed in at 180 pounds each, including the PLSS backpacks. You would think that with the advanced technology now available, NASA would have been able to streamline the package. To the contrary, the suits now worn aboard the space shuttle weigh in at 310 pounds each, and ILC claims that it takes 3 months and 5,000 man-hours to produce each one. Back in the 1960s, they claimed to be cranking out a minimum of 9 of them for each Apollo flight. One final note on the Magic suits. They were also allegedly designed for what was euphemistically dubbed sanitation management. According to the designers, the suits contained urine bags attached to the astronauts via what were described as condoms. How that would have actually worked is anyone's guess. The existence of fecal bags were also alluded to, but no details were given. For what it's worth, NASA says that its astronauts now wear what are euphemistically dubbed MAGs, or maximum absorbency garments, under their spacesuits. The same product is more commonly referred to as an adult diaper, and that is likely what the Apollo crews would have worn as well had they actually gone on their alleged missions. That would, though, I suppose, have taken a bit of glamour away from the romanticized notion of being a space traveler. Another piece of advanced technology that had to be developed for the Apollo program was the command module, the cone-shaped tip of the Saturn V rocket that was to be the only piece of the original launch vehicle that returned to Earth. To this day, the Apollo command modules remain the only capsules ever designed that were allegedly capable of keeping astronauts alive while re-entering the Earth's atmosphere from outside low Earth orbit. According to those who claim to know about such things, re-entering from beyond low Earth orbit is an exponentially more risky maneuver than re-entering from Earth orbit. First of all, Apollo capsules were allegedly traveling at 25,000 miles per hour at the time of re-entry as opposed to the 17,000 miles per hour that spacecraft travel in Earth orbit. That additional speed results in a doubling of the already intensely high temperatures experienced during re-entry. In addition, the returning Apollo command modules had to enter Earth's atmosphere at precisely the right angle. If they hit too wide an angle, the spacecraft would essentially bounce off and veer into space. And if they hit it too sharp of an angle, the spaceship and its crew would not survive the impact. The capsule also had to be in the proper orientation, with the bottom, and thus the heat shield, pointing down. Luckily, though, all 9 of the Apollo modules that allegedly returned from the moon hit that narrow window in the proper orientation, despite the fact that the command modules, having jettisoned the attached service modules, had no propulsion or steering capability. The contract to design and build the command modules was assigned to North American Aviation, whose engineers, it's safe to say, had a quite formidable task before them. As noted on moon machines, the combined command and service modules would require a propulsion system, a navigation system, an environmental control system, plentiful supplies of oxygen, water, and food, heat shields capable of handling re-entry temperatures beyond anything before experienced, parachutes capable of performing near-miraculous feats, a human waste disposal system, shaving supplies, hygiene supplies, life preservers, protection from micrometeorites, and, for reasons left unexplained, machetes. What also wasn't explained was why the lunar modules, which would be exposed throughout the flight to the moon, didn't need that very same protection from micrometeorites. By the end of 1966, naturally enough, North American already had a prototype command module ready for NASA to put through the pre-flight test regimen. As designed, the command module featured living space measuring roughly 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet. On January 27, 1967, Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White squeezed into that confined space for what was dubbed a plugs-out test, to verify that the ship was capable of running under its own power. There was another test scheduled that day as well, a pressurization test of the cabin. Allegedly to save time, NASA opted to conduct both tests simultaneously, so once astronauts were in place, the cabin was filled with 16 psi of pure oxygen. With the inward opening hatch sealed by the interior cabin pressure, the astronauts never had a chance to survive the, quote, test. All it took was a spark, allegedly from some faulty wiring, to turn the capsule into a crematorium. In a pressurized oxygen environment, even aluminum will ignite. The crew reportedly were dead within 30 seconds of the onset of the fire. It took rescuers 5 minutes to pry the hatch open. Weighing in with perhaps the most appalling quote to make it into these articles, George Jeffs, the chief engineer of the command and service modules, had this to say, quote, "From a technical point of view, I think the fire had a very beneficial effect on the program. It enabled the program to stop and review exactly where we stood on every element of the system and to fix every problem that we saw in the system. Of course, roughly the same effect would have been achieved by burning up the module while the astronauts were not in it, but there's no need to quibble over minor details, I suppose." It took 18 months to redesign the command module. Over 100 design changes were made to correct the various shortcomings. This redesign process was undoubtedly made more difficult by the fact that no paper records had been kept of what had been installed in the module. As we've already seen, the Apollo program didn't place a high priority on record keeping. One bit of technology that had to be developed for the command modules, presumably for the lunar modules as well, was what Moon Machines described as, quote, "an environmental control system designed to cope with the most extreme environment ever encountered by humans." Cliff Hess was an environmental systems test engineer with NASA during the Apollo days, and he described the challenge they faced as follows, quote, "You can go from 250 degrees Fahrenheit down to minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and it can happen just as you cross the line of a shadow. So you can instantaneously go from one extreme to the other and have like a 500-degree Fahrenheit change." Apollo 8 astronaut Frank Borman described his alleged flight to and from the moon in precisely the same terms. Quote, "You'd be 250 degree plus on the sunny side, and once the spaceship rotated and you were in the shade, then you were minus 250. This is yet another example of a claim that I previously made that was ridiculed by the debunker brigade as being ill-informed. And yet here we see once again that the very same claim has been made by one of the guys who actually worked on that aspect of the project, as well as by one of the guys who allegedly flew the missions. It's rather shocking to find that so many of the people who developed and or utilized the Apollo technology actually know significantly less about it than the debunkers. Before running their mouths off to documentary film crews, these old-timers should really visit a couple of debunking websites. I wonder why it is, by the way, that the Apollo 13 astronauts were said to have been very cold throughout their return flight in their allegedly crippled spaceship. As recalled by Jim Lovell, the trip was marked by discomfort beyond lack of food and water. Sleep was almost impossible because of the cold. When we turned off the electrical systems, we lost our source of heat, and the sun streaming in the windows didn't help much. It wasn't simply that the temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The sight of the perspiring walls and wet windows made it seem even colder. We considered putting on our spacesuits, but they would have been bulky and too sweaty. We found the CM a cold, clammy tin can when we started to power up. The wall, ceiling, floor, wire harnesses, the panels were all covered with droplets of water. There is so much wrong with that brief description of the flight that it's difficult to know where to begin critiquing it. But let's start by pondering why they would have been short on food and water. The mission ended up returning a few days early, so unless they overindulged the first few days, there should have been more than enough food and water for the trio in the conjoined command and lunar modules. And as for the cold, how could that 250-degree Fahrenheit sun streaming in the windows not help much? As for the water droplets covering the interior of the command and lunar modules, wouldn't many of those droplets have been airborne if they were in a zero-gravity environment? Wouldn't the inside of the module have looked something like a snow globe? And as for opting not to don the spacesuits, that's just laughably absurd. As already noted, without the suits, the only thing that would have been protecting the astronauts from the hazards of space would have been a double layer of aluminum foil. For that reason alone, it's inconceivable that they wouldn't have been wearing them. And now we find that they're also facing near-freezing conditions, and they still chose not to utilize the suits, because the suits were, you know, a little bulky, and it's much better to nearly freeze to death than to break a little sweat. Anyway, returning more or less to where we left off, Apollo 7, equipped with the redesigned command module, became the first manned Apollo flight to triumphantly lift off from Cape Kennedy on October 11, 1968. 3 previous flights had gone up unmanned. This one wasn't quite a real Apollo launch, however, since it was powered by the smaller Saturn V rocket. No one had yet ridden the Saturn V rocket off the launch pad, and there's just 1 year to go to meet Kennedy's goal of landing men on the moon. Apollo 7 was the first of a series of Apollo launches that came in an incredibly rapid succession. Just 71 days after Apollo 7 took flight, Apollo 8 lifted off. Apollo 9 followed just 72 days later, followed by Apollo 10 76 days after that. A mere 59 days later, Apollo 11 took flight. In just 9 months, NASA assembled and launched 5 incredibly complex, multi-staged rockets, and ILC provided at least 45 spacesuits. 3 of those ships allegedly flew all the way to the moon. Apollo 8 would be the first to allegedly do so. Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we'll be getting into part 10 of Wagging the Moondoggie by David McGowan. Let's jump right in. The mission of Apollo 8, quite apart from its significant scientific meaning, stimulated an immense rejuvenation of the spirit of mankind, and that spirit needed rejuvenation. A year featured by 2 grim assassinations, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, by riots, by racial and social strife, and a baffling attempt to end the war left men with a dull sense of frustration. Then, at the end of such a year, came the Apollo 8, an incredible adventure. Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason. Apollo 8 was the last Apollo flight to leave the ground during the Johnson administration. A decade before the launch, LBJ had laid out America's goals and the space race, and none of them had much to do with sending men to the moon. Quote, "Control of space means control of the world. From space, the Masters of Infinity would have the power to control Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change climates." I thought it was global warming that was supposed to be causing most of that, but I guess that's a bit off topic. To anyone paying close attention in the 1960s, the ridiculously improbable flight of Apollo 8 should have sent a clear signal that the Apollo moon missions were going to be seriously lacking in credibility. Launched on the winter solstice of 1968, Apollo 8 was only the 3rd launch of a Saturn V rocket, and the first to carry a crew. The first 2 Saturn V launches, Apollo 4 and Apollo 6, were what NASA referred to as all-up tests of the 3-stage launch vehicle. Those tests didn't go so well. The team of rocket scientists who had developed the F-1 and J-2 rocket engines that powered the flights, most of whom were former Nazis, were courted through Project Paperclip and relocated to White Sands and then to Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. One of the best sources of information on this is Linda Hunt's Secret Agenda, St. Martin's Press, 1991. See also Tom Bauer's The Paperclip Conspiracy by Little and Brown, 1987. This team of scientists had assumed that each stage of the craft would be tested separately. They were reportedly horrified to find that NASA was bypassing such tests and proceeding directly to an all-up test of Apollo 4, but probably not nearly as horrified as the American people would have been if they had known the truth about the past lives of NASA's rocket scientists. And there's a photo of the team here. Nevertheless, the launch of Apollo 4, the very first Saturn V launch, was allegedly a smashing success. That claim seems rather dubious, however, given that the next all-up test of Apollo 6 was marked by multiple malfunctions. The first stage burn had serious vibration problems, and 2 of the second stage's 5 engines cut out, throwing the ship seriously off course. According to Moon Machines, NASA was undeterred by the serious problems encountered during the flight of Apollo 6. Quote, despite the near loss of Apollo 6, NASA was pushing ahead with Apollo 8, the third flight of the Saturn V, and the first to carry a crew. NASA was so confident, in fact, that they decided to throw caution to the wind and swing for the fence with Apollo 8. Quote, the third flight of the Saturn V would carry astronauts not to orbit the Earth, as everyone had expected, but to orbit the Moon. Had the Apollo program been a real space exploration endeavor, the first manned flight of the Saturn V would obviously have gone no further than low Earth orbit, as had been planned. This would have likely been followed by an unmanned flight to the Moon, and then possibly a flight piloted by a dog or some other such mammalian life form. But taking logical, methodical steps toward achieving goals in space was for the guys over in Russia. America was going to take the John Wayne approach. Without taking any of the preliminary steps, and with a launch vehicle that had failed on its last outing, and without knowing if the ship itself could make the journey there and back, America was going to send men all the way to the Moon. Not to worry, though, NASA was confident that all the problems with Apollo 6 had been diagnosed and fixed, and in record time. Despite the fact that the failed stages of the aircraft weren't available for inspection, NASA's crack team were able to expertly pinpoint and correct all of the deficiencies so thoroughly that the new and improved Saturn V rocket didn't even need a test flight to see if it was going to be working correctly. Indeed, it was ready to go all the way to the Moon. Given America's track record in the space race, which from the very beginning was marked by disappointments and desperate attempts to keep up with the Joneses, it was a serious move. Following the October 4, 1957 launch of Sputnik 1, a 184-pound Soviet satellite, the U.S. attempted to respond by launching Vanguard, a 3-pound sphere roughly the size of a large grapefruit, on December 6, 1957. With the nation nervously looking on, Vanguard rose approximately 5 feet from the launch pad, before blowing up in a blaze of glory. The U.S. had better luck on January 31, 1958, when it officially entered the space race with the successful launch of Explorer 1, a 31-pound satellite. The Soviets, meanwhile, had already successfully launched Sputnik 3, a nearly 3,000-pound satellite described in Time Life's To the Moon as an orbiting space laboratory. America clearly had some catching up to do. Once NASA's engineers turned their attention to the Moon as a target of unmanned space flights, disappointment continued to be the operative word. Beginning in August 1961, the United States began attempting to crash land an unmanned craft onto the Moon through the Ranger program. The first 6 such attempts failed. Ranger 1 and Ranger 2 both failed on the launch pad. Ranger 3 launched successfully but missed the Moon. Ranger 4 became disabled and drifted about aimlessly. Ranger 5 also shut down and missed the Moon, and the cameras aboard Ranger 6 failed, rendering it useless. Finally, on July 31, 1964, nearly 3 full years after the first launch, Ranger 7 successfully impacted and photographed the Moon. Rangers 8 and 9 followed in February and March of 1965. The 3 successful probes gathered a combined total of roughly 17,000 images, which didn't change the fact that the Ranger program overall had a 67% failure rate. The next year, NASA launched 2 new lunar reconnaissance programs, Surveyor and the Lunar Orbiter program. The first Surveyor blasted off on May 30, 1966, with 6 more to follow, the last on January 7, 1968. The goal of the program was to attempt soft landings on the lunar surface. 2 of the missions, Surveyor 2 and Surveyor 4, crashed, leaving the program with roughly 29% failure rate. The Surveyor and Ranger programs had a combined failure rate of 50%. NASA had much better luck with the Lunar Orbiter program, which involved putting 5 satellites into lunar orbit between August of 1966 and August of 1967. Each of the 5 orbited the Moon, capturing high-resolution images for an average of 10 days each. In addition to mapping the lunar surface, the orbiters also sent back the first images of Earth from space and the first photos of the Earth rising over the lunar horizon. In all, some 3,000 images were beamed back, officially at least. The problem here, of course, is that NASA's numbers don't seem to add up. Does it make any sense at all that the 3 successful Ranger missions which flew directly to the Moon and immediately crashed sent back 17,000 images, and yet the 5 orbiters, which spent a combined total of 53 days orbiting the Moon, sent back just 3,000 images? There's a capture rate of just over 2 images per hour, and the orbiters had multiple cameras on board. There's little doubt that the orbiters returned far more images than claimed, of which only a select few, relatively speaking, were released. What then happened to the rest of them? I'm going to go way out on a limb here and guess that NASA needed those images for another more important project, faking the Apollo moon landings. All of those glorious shots of Earth from space, and of those Earth rises, and superimposed spacecraft in lunar orbit were undoubtedly created from unreleased imagery captured by the orbiters, as were no doubt the fake lunar sets and the fake lunar backdrops. One final note on the lunar orbiters: during their flights to and around the Moon, the 5 satellites recorded 22 micrometeoroid events. The 8 lunar modules that made the trip to the moon apparently recorded no such events, or maybe the guys just put some duct tape over the holes. Meanwhile, NASA's manned space programs were having trouble as well. In the beginning, of course, there were the Mercury 7, the nation's first space-age celebrities. Immortalized in the movie The Right Stuff, the first 7 astronauts were handpicked from among hundreds of the nation's finest fighter pilots. 6 of those 7, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, and Gordo Cooper, would become the first Americans in space. But for most of them, it would not be an entirely smooth ride. Shepard was the first to take flight aboard the Freedom 7, launched on May 5, 1961. His was an uneventful 15-minute suborbital flight. Grissom followed on July 21, 1961 in the Liberty Bell 7, and things didn't go so well for him. As with Shepard, his was just a suborbital flight, but it nearly cost him his life. Immediately after splashing down, the hatch blew on his capsule and it began taking on water. Grissom got free, but his suit, which was supposed to serve as a flotation device, also began taking on water, pulling him under. Grissom's plight did not improve with the arrival of a rescue helicopter, which concentrated exclusively on trying to save the capsule, ignoring the struggling Grissom, who now also had to contend with the helicopter's rotor wash. Grissom was pulled to safety only when a second rescue helicopter arrived. The capsule sunk to the bottom of the sea, 3 miles below. Glenn was up next. He was slated to be the first American in orbit. Riding aboard the Friendship 7, launched on February 20, 1962, Glenn did make it into orbit, but NASA was not at all sure how they were going to be able to get him back. The launch had been delayed for a month as NASA worked out various problems, but there was still a serious glitch. During Glenn's second orbit, technicians on the ground determined that the heat shield, essential for re-entry, had come loose. Glenn's capsule was seriously damaged during re-entry, but he survived unharmed and became an instant national hero. Next up was Carpenter, who orbited the Earth 3 times aboard the Aurora 7 on May 24, 1962. Running low on fuel, Carpenter barely made re-entry, and the wrong angle of re-entry caused him to splash some 250 miles off course and out of radio contact. It took rescue crews 3 hours to find him floating in the Atlantic. Some on the ground blamed Carpenter for the mishap, claiming that he had wasted fuel by acting like a tourist trying to see all the sights. Schirra was up to bat next, and he blasted off on October 3, 1962, aboard the Sigma 7, completing 6 orbits in just over 9 hours. His was the first flight since Shepard's, and the first orbital flight to be free of any significant malfunctions. The final Mercury flight was helmed by Cooper, who lifted off on May 15, 1963, inside the Faith 7 capsule. Cooper completed 22 orbits and was the first American to sleep in space. Problems arose in the final hours, however, when the capsule's automatic controls failed and Cooper had to execute the first fully manual re-entry. It would be nearly 2 years before the next Americans followed Cooper into space. Overall, the Mercury program was largely a success in the sense that everyone made it back alive and well, but America had a very long way to go to get men to the moon. Next up was the Gemini program, featuring a larger 2-man capsule, Gemini, which ran from March 1965 to November of 1966, had very specific goals: testing man's ability to survive in space for up to 2 weeks, testing rendezvous and docking procedures, performing EVAs or spacewalks, and making orbital adjustments. All of these were to be practiced until they became almost second nature. The Gemini capsules were launched into orbit with Titan rockets, which proved to be a bit unstable at first. The first launch attempts blew up on the pad. Eventually, NASA successfully launched 2 that didn't blow up, and those were christened Gemini 1 and Gemini 2. Those were followed by 10 manned Gemini flights, beginning with the Gemini 3, launched on March 23, 1965, and concluding with Gemini 12, which took flight on November 11, 1966. The flight of the Gemini 3 was a short one, completing 3 orbits in just under 5 hours. Due to an equipment malfunction, pilots Gus Grissom and John Young had to manually control their re-entry and splash down some 60 miles off target. Other than that, the first manned Gemini mission was successful. Gemini 4, launched on June 3, 1965, remained in orbit for just over 4 days and featured the alleged spacewalk by Ed White, NASA's photos of which are, needless to say, spectacular. And once again, these photos are great. After a successful liftoff on August 21, 1965, Gemini 5 remained in low Earth orbit for nearly 8 days, completing 120 orbits. The flight was largely successful, though a malfunctioning fuel cell and faulty thrusters did cause some problems for the crew. Upon their return, it should be noted the Gemini 5's pilots, Gordo Cooper and Pete Conrad, looked tired, haggard, and unshaven, with their hair greasy and matted. In other words, they looked exactly as you would expect guys who had just spent a week in a cramped spaceship with no means of attending to basic matters of hygiene Below, left to right, are photos of Conrad after returning from his 8-day mission, Lovell after returning from a 4-day mission aboard Gemini 12, and Lovell again toward the end of his 14-day flight on Gemini 7. The Apollo astronauts, on the other hand, all arrived home looking rested, shaved, and fresh-faced, as though they had just returned from a day at the spa. The next scheduled launch was Gemini 6, set to take flight in late October of 1965. The flight was postponed, however, due to the failure of an unmanned Agena craft launched as a docking target. On December 4th, Gemini 7, with Frank Borman and Jim Lovell on board, began a grueling 14-day stay in low Earth orbit. About a week later, Gemini 6 was once again ready for launch, but that launch was aborted when an engine shut down, narrowly averting a fatal explosion on the pad. Gemini 6 finally got into low Earth orbit on December 11th and remained there for just over 1 day. During that time, Gemini 6 allegedly performed a rendezvous maneuver with Gemini 7, the two spacecraft remaining side by side for some 5.5 hours while traveling at 17,000 miles per hour. Curiously, there was a launch of a military rocket in between the launches of Gemini 6 and 7, and Lovell has said that the launch was connected in some unspecified manner to the mission of Gemini 7. Gemini 8, helmed by Neil Armstrong and David Scott, blasted off on March 16, 1966. The goal of the mission was to test rendezvous and docking procedures, and to achieve the first successful docking between a Gemini capsule and an unmanned Agena craft. Curiously, the two pilots chosen for this complex mission were both rookies. The crew that had originally been slated to fly the mission, Elliot C. and Charles Bassett, were killed on February 28, 1966, just days before the launch, when C., one of the nation's top pilots, slammed a T-38 Talon into the side of a building in St. Louis. Gemini 8 reportedly succeeded in docking with the Agena target, but trouble began almost immediately. The conjoined spacecraft began to tumble violently end over end, forcing Armstrong to jettison the Agena. That, however, only caused the Gemini capsule to tumble even more violently. Armstrong finally had to resort to firing the rockets used for re-entry positioning to stabilize the craft, which necessitated immediately aborting the mission. The capsule splashed down in the Pacific, a half a world away from its target in the Atlantic. On June 3, 1966, Gemini 9, piloted by Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan, took flight. The launch had been postponed due to failure of another Agena target. The goal was, once again, to dock with an unmanned Agena craft. That docking failed to materialize, however, when yet another Agena target malfunctioned. This was also the flight on which Cernan took his nearly fatal spacewalk. There was a debate on the ground over whether he should be cut loose to drift in space, or left tethered to burn up upon re-entry if he couldn't make it back in. Following Gemini 9, there were only 3 manned Gemini missions left, and the United States had thus far failed to come anywhere close to mastering either docking procedures or EVAs, both of which would be absolutely essential for the success of the proposed Apollo missions. Gemini 10, with John Young and Michael Collins at the wheel, lifted off on July 18, 1966, and remained in orbit for just under 3 days. Young and Collins reportedly achieved the first successful, stable docking of a Gemini capsule with an Agena target. Collins also performed a largely unsuccessful EVA, though not as disastrous as Cernan's on the previous flight. Gemini 11, piloted by Charles Conrad and Richard Gordon, took to the skies on September 12, 1966, and, like Gemini 10, remained in orbit for just under 3 days. And like Gemini 10, the mission included a docking maneuver with an Agena target and a less than fully successful spacewalk by Gordon. The final Gemini mission, Gemini 12, put Jim Lovell and Buzz Aldrin into low Earth orbit for just under 4 days. Aldrin completed the first successful spacewalk, and the two pilots once again practiced docking with an Agena target. NASA had come a long way since shooting Alan Shepard out of a cannon in May of 1961, but the moon still seemed like a far-off goal. The progression from Mercury to Gemini from a single-occupancy capsule to a somewhat more sophisticated double-occupancy capsule, requiring a somewhat larger launch vehicle, was a natural one. NASA's next step, however, was going to be more of a quantum leap. The Saturn V rocket bore little resemblance to any previous launch vehicles. As Apollo flight director Gene Kranz observed, quote, "It was a new spacecraft. It was something that we had to learn from the ground up, that we had to learn from scratch." It was a massive and massively complex spacecraft. The Saturn V was so much larger than its predecessors that all previous manned launch vehicles, the 6 Mercury and 10 Gemini vehicles, could fit inside a single Saturn V casing. A fully assembled launch-ready Saturn V stood 363 feet tall and weighed in at roughly 6 million pounds. 90% of which was fuel weight. Depending on who's telling the story, it contained either 6 million or 9 million parts. There were 3 disposable launch stages, atop which sat the lunar service and command modules, which was then capped off with a launch escape system that was jettisoned shortly after liftoff. The 138-foot-tall first stage featured 5 massive F-1 rocket engines, each of which consumed 3 tons of fuel per second. They were fed by a 331,000-gallon tank of liquid oxygen and a 203,000-gallon tank of refined kerosene, all of which was consumed in just 2.5 minutes, generating some 7.5 million pounds of thrust, or 160 million horsepower. After that first stage fell away, at an altitude of approximately 35 miles, the 82-foot-long second stage, powered by 5 J-2 rocket engines, took over. The J-2s burned a combination of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, propelling the ship to an altitude of 115 miles. After the second stage dropped away, the 61-foot-long third stage, powered by a single J-2 engine, took over, putting the spacecraft into low Earth orbit. As Time Life noted, the third stage, quote, will not be jettisoned at this time. Instead, 3 hours later, it will be restarted to fire the Apollo toward the Moon. At 10,350 miles from Earth, the command module, powered by its service module, will separate from the third stage, make a half-circle turn back toward the third stage as the lunar module's shroud of the third stage opens. The command module will dock with the lunar module, which is to ferry the astronauts between the command module and the Moon, then back it free of the third stage. After completing another half-circle turn, the 2 modules, nose to nose, will head toward the Moon. Sounds easy enough. I can see why they were able to nail it every single time, unlike the problems they had with those troublesome Agena craft. Time Life also fills us in on the details of the probe and drogue docking mechanism. Quote, the probe, a 10-inch cylinder extending from the nose of the command module, must be inserted into the cone-shaped receptacle, the drogue of the LM, or the lunar module. As the probe finds its mark, automatic spring latches lock the 2 together. The whole probe and drogue assembly will be removed, clearing the tunnel through which the astronauts will enter the lunar module. Inside the command module pilot flips a switch that frees the lunar module. Pictured below are the command module's docking probe, the LEM's drogue, with the LEM allegedly in Earth orbit on the alleged Apollo 9 mission, and yet another spectacular shot from NASA's collection, and a close-up of how the mechanism was supposed to work. Curiously left unexplained was how, with the probe and drogue assembly having been removed, the LEM was able to dock with the command module the second time upon its return from the lunar surface. I'm sure, though, that the folks over at the Bout Forum will be able to explain it. Maybe they can also explain why it is that the space shuttle never went to the Moon. I was thinking about that the other day as I was reading another heaping pile of debunker blather about how once you're into low Earth orbit, 90% of the work of getting to the Moon is already done. Debunkers, you see, claim that comparing the distance astronauts travel in space today, which is 200 miles, with the distance they traveled back in the magical 1960s, which was 234,000 miles, is entirely unfair because it is, as anybody knows, during the first 200 miles, all that heavy lifting is done. Once you're in low Earth orbit, it's a fairly easy matter to briefly fire the engines and slingshot out of orbit and set a course for the Moon. And getting back is just as easy. Just slingshot around the Moon and cruise on back to Earth. It hardly even requires any fuel. It's just a matter of, falling through the void of space. If that is the case, however, then how come none of the space shuttles during the more than a quarter century of that program has ever done a flyby of the Moon? The Apollo 13 crew allegedly made the flight in a lunar module composed of popsicle sticks and Scotch tape. Yet the obviously vastly more sophisticated space shuttle can't make it there and back? Really? Why couldn't it on any one of its missions just have used the old slingshot approach to get to the Moon and back? And please, let's not trot out the old "there was no reason to do that as there was nothing to gain" excuse. The space shuttle is far better shielded than the Apollo craft were. It carries plenty of fuel and plenty of provisions to last for the duration of the trip. Indeed, today's astronauts should be able to travel to the Moon and back in relative comfort. So why has it never been done? Apollo 8 did it all the way back in 1968, which I started to talk about at the top of this post before getting hopelessly sidetracked. More on that next time.
People are waking up, they see the world ties we have with God. The evidence shows there's no curvature at all. Yet science tells us that we're living on a ball. I don't claim to understand the trigonometry. We're not on a spinning globe, this anyone can see.
Is that a plane or is it the rocket? Was that the rocket lifting off?
Yep, that's it.
That's a noise. I've never heard it before. It's drifting. That's bad.
It's doing good so far.
Is it? Is that what always happens? Does it always go like that?
Yep.
It looks bad to me. It's in space. Or is it? Is that it?
Yep, I think that's it.
Right in the middle.
Mark.
Oh no, it's going down!
Well, Mark.
Peter, or Sandy, is it turning or is the Earth spinning?
A rainbow.
Sandy? It's not turning, the Earth is spinning. Sandy?
Already.
That's going straight up, it's just the Earth is turning, we're moving away from it.
Is that what always happens? Does it always go like that?
Yep.
It looks bad to me. Is that what always happens? Does it always go like that?
Yep.
It looks bad to me.
Mark.
Oh no, it's going down! It's going down!
Peter, or Sandy, is it turning or is the Earth spinning?
A rainbow.
Sandy? It's not turning, the Earth is spinning. Sandy?
Already.
That's going straight up, it's just the Earth is turning, we're moving away from it.
Is that what always happens? It looks bad to me.
Mark.
Oh no, it's going down! It's going down!
Sandy?
Already.
That's going straight up, it's just the Earth is turning, we're moving away from it.
Today we're going to continue with Wagging the Moondoggie, Part 11. We're working our way through. We only have a few more parts after this, so jump over to centerforuninformedamerica.com, hit the Features tab, and jump down to Moondoggie. By all means, avail yourself of the imagery, which really make the articles that much more interesting. Let's jump right in. To see the Earth as it truly is, small and blue and beautiful in that eternal silence where it floats, is to see ourselves as riders on the Earth together, brothers on that bright loveliness in the eternal cold, brothers who know now that they are truly brothers. Archibald MacLeish, Skull and Bonesman, and uncle of actor Bruce Dern, reflecting on the alleged flight of Apollo 8. In the first of this series of posts, I mentioned that the Apollo story was connected to the Laurel Canyon story by way of a facility known as Lookout Mountain Laboratory, the intelligence community's top-secret, state-of-the-art film studio nestled high in the Hollywood Hills. As it turns out, there's another interesting connection as well. During the span of precisely 1 month, during the infamous summer of 1969, the Laurel Canyon and Apollo stories reached a simultaneous climax of sorts. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11, the flight that would allegedly land men on the moon for the first time, took flight. 5 days later, on July 21st, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin allegedly first set foot on lunar soil. 3 days later, the trio of Apollo astronauts triumphantly returned home to a hero's welcome. Exactly 1 week later, the first letter from the so-called Zodiac Killer was received by authorities. 8 days after that, on the night of August 8, 1969, Sharon Tate and 4 others were slaughtered in Roman Polanski's Benedict Canyon home. The next night, Rosemary and Lino LaBianca were carved up in their Los Feliz home. All of these killings would later be attributed to Canyon regular Charlie Manson and his family. Less than a week after the killings, some of Laurel Canyon's premier bands took stage at Woodstock to celebrate the other side of the canyon scene. It was a time of supreme weirdness, with extreme and very high-profile violence weaving its way through the flower power scenes both in Los Angeles and San Francisco, while 234,000 miles away, squeaky-clean astronauts who bore little resemblance to members of the Woodstock generation allegedly beamed back live footage from the moon. Anyway, I think when we left off we were discussing the highly improbable flight of Apollo 8. The very first manned launch of a Saturn V, which took flight, as I previously mentioned, on the winter solstice of 1968. The mighty Apollo spacecraft, which had failed on its last unmanned outing, purportedly flew all the way to the moon, did 10 quick laps around Earth's nearest neighbor, and then flew back home with every one of its 9 million parts performing flawlessly. Thanks for that was due in part, according to the official Apollo legend, to a band of surfers in Seal Beach. North American Aviation, you see, had a bit of a problem with keeping the liquefied hydrogen and oxygen in the Saturn V's second stage from boiling in the Florida sun. The proposed solution was to insulate the fuel tanks with honeycomb insulation, but NASA's engineers had trouble keeping the insulation from popping back off. The solution to that problem was to hire local surfers who, according to Moon Machines, brought with them a special skill set. NASA claimed, by the way, to shoot for 99.9% accuracy in the manufacture of its Apollo spacecraft, which shouldn't have been a problem for a workforce composed of Nazi rocket scientists, bra seamstresses, and surfers. Even if that lofty goal had been attained, however, that would still have left 9,000 defective parts per launch vehicle, or 6,000 if the figure of 6 million parts is correct. The first alleged live broadcast from the moon came during prime time hours on Christmas Eve, though I'm sure that was just a chance occurrence. The 3 astronauts allegedly riding aboard Apollo 8, Frank Borman, William Anders, and the ever-popular Jim Lovell, in what was billed as a purely spontaneous gesture, took turns reading aloud 10 verses from the book of Genesis, which they followed up with, quote, "Good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth." The impeccable timing of the historic Apollo 8 broadcast, reportedly heard by 1 of every 4 people on the planet, would set a standard that would be adhered to by all subsequent Apollo flights. The very first moonwalk by Neil and Buzz was broadcast, live of course, at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, as though it were a Monday night football game. Primetime moonwalks became a staple of the Apollo program, to such an extent that it was not at all uncommon for the networks to be deluged with complaints when a popular weekly sitcom was preempted for yet another fake live moonwalk. After the second fake moon landing, NASA began adding exciting new elements to the Apollo missions to combat public apathy. Apollo 13, of course, added the element of danger. Apollo 14 brought us the moon in Technicolor, with the first color video broadcasts. Apollo 15 kept us entertained with the addition of a moondoggie. And Apollo 17 featured the first and only spectacular night launch of a Saturn V rocket. Apollo 8 was quickly followed by Apollo 9, which was originally scheduled to lift off on February 28, 1969, just 2 short months after the crew of Apollo 8 had splashed down. Luckily, the water in Southern California is a little cold during the winter months, and the waves aren't so good, so the surfers down in Seal Beach were probably able to put in lots of overtime to meet the demanding production schedule. Apollo 9 was the first Saturn V flight to allegedly have a lunar module stowed away on board. The mission allegedly featured the first docking maneuvers with, and the very first flight of, a lunar module, albeit in low Earth orbit rather than in lunar orbit. Apollo 9 was also allegedly the first flight whose crew donned the newly designed Apollo Playtex spacesuits. All things considered, Apollo 9's 10-day flight in low Earth orbit was largely a letdown after the previous crew had allegedly flown all the way to the moon and back, and done so like true cowboys without the new magic suits. There was one very odd thing, though, never mentioned in the official histories of the space program, that happened during the flight of Apollo 9. While lounging in the command module, unencumbered by spacesuits, gloves, and helmets, with the luxury of being able to hold their NASA-issue cameras in their hands, the crew, James McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Swikert, took photos of each other that are unfocused, poorly composed, and not particularly well exposed, which is, of course, exactly the results that one would expect from amateur photographers using cameras that lack viewfinders. However, after those very same astronauts donned their suits, gloves, and helmets and then ventured out for a spacewalk, making it rather difficult for them to stabilize themselves and therefore their cameras, something truly wondrous and magical happened. The crew of Apollo 9 suddenly gained the ability to shoot absolutely stunning compositions that looked like they were professionally produced in a studio. Though it's hard to pick a favorite, the one featuring the Earth's reflection perfectly framed in one of the actors' helmet visors is pretty impressive. All of the astronauts on the future Apollo missions, of course, proved themselves to be exceptional photographers as well, but only when operating under the most difficult of conditions. Neil Armstrong, the very first photojournalist allegedly to work on the moon, that most foreign of environments, set the bar exceedingly high for those who were to follow. H.J.P. Arnold, considered to be one of the world's foremost authorities on space photography before his death in June 2006, once said of the film magazine allegedly shot by Armstrong, "That sequence of images on the lunar surface, taken mainly by Armstrong, of course, with that one camera, that film, I would say, has never, ever been bettered, whether on the moon or subsequently. Almost every one of those relatively small number of images taken by Armstrong appear to be splendidly composed. You remember that classic face-on picture of Aldrin with his visor reflecting the entire landing scene? The lunar module, the flag, the TV camera, and Armstrong taking the picture, reflected in the visor? It's a marvelous picture." Some may argue that he clearly was not playing in the same league as, say, Ansel Adams, but I beg to differ. Adams created some awe-inspiring work, to be sure, but could he have done so while wearing a spacesuit, gloves, and helmet, and with his camera mounted to his chest, and while acclimating himself to an environment that featured no air, greatly reduced gravity, and extreme heat and cold? I think not. Speaking of stage photos, by the way, take a look at the photo below, allegedly shot on the moon by the last men to set foot there, the crew of the Apollo 17, Gene Cernan, Ronald Evans, and Jack Schmitt. It reminds me of something I've seen before, possibly some type of symbol, but I can't quite place it. Just 2 months after the return of Apollo 9, NASA sent Apollo 10 off to the moon with Tom Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan on board. The space agency obviously wanted to get the fake preliminary flights out of the way as quickly as possible so they can get on to the main event. The launch pace would slow considerably once the fake landings began with the next flight, Apollo 11, which blasted off just 7 weeks after the return of Apollo 10. Apollo 10, the third manned launch of a Saturn V, once again allegedly went to the moon, this time with a lunar module mounted to the nose of the command module. The Apollo 10 mission allegedly included everything that later missions would experience, short of actually landing on the lunar surface. Once allegedly in lunar orbit, the lunar module was deployed and flown down fairly close to the surface before returning to and successfully docking with the command and service modules. Having endured the perilous initial launch and then the 250,000-mile flight to the moon, followed by the successful deployment and flight of the LEM, and having gotten to within passing distance of being the first men to create those historic first footprints on the moon, it would naturally have been tempting to ignore mission control and set down for a quick stroll into history. To prevent this, according to the official mythology, NASA diabolically short-fueled the LEM for the Apollo 10 mission. There was, of course, no possibility that some unforeseen circumstances might have necessitated the use of that additional fuel or necessitated a landing on the moon, which would have been a bit of a PR nightmare for the agency. Walter Cronkite would have had to break the news to the American people. The crew of Apollo 10 unexpectedly became the first men to set foot on the moon just moments ago, and we have been promised live footage momentarily. Unfortunately, their spacecraft was deliberately short-fueled, so they will not be able to make the return flight to dock with the mothership, and both astronauts will soon die. This should make for some riveting TV, though, so stay tuned. The last of the major Apollo contracts to be awarded was for the ever-popular lunar rovers, aka moondoggies. The initial idea for a lunar vehicle is generally credited to Wernher von Braun, who envisioned a mobile pressurized lab weighing some 4 tons capable of carrying enough provisions to keep 2 astronauts alive for up to 2 weeks. The concept, dubbed MOLAB, would have required the launch of a separate Saturn V rocket, so the idea was dropped as being too expensive, although NASA seems to have had a virtually inexhaustible supply of Saturn Vs. When the Apollo program was scrubbed, NASA already had all the hardware built for flights 18, 19, and 20, and had all the crews trained as well. NASA supposedly gave up entirely on the idea of placing a vehicle on the moon, but General Motors Defense Research Laboratories purportedly soldiered on, putting the company's own money into research and development of the vehicle. As the story goes, NASA told the team at GM that if they could somehow come up with a way of fitting an operational vehicle into an impossibly small lunar module equipment bay, the agency might consider incorporating the vehicle into future Apollo missions. Speaking of the lunar modules, by the way, I happened to stumble across the photo below of the LEM's mighty descent engine, which, as can be clearly seen, would have hardly taken up any room at all in the spacious spacecraft's descent stage. Its fuel tanks wouldn't have required much space either, so there should have been plenty of room left to stow a folding dune buggy in a curiously empty equipment bay. Below is a NASA-approved photo of the rover folded up and ready to pack into its assigned equipment bay, along with a photo of the folded rover allegedly stowed away on an LEM that has clearly seen better days. And here's a brief video clip of the deployment of the folded rover being demonstrated, presumably at the manufacturing plant. As can be clearly seen, particularly in the video clip, the rover, as initially deployed, was far from complete. It seems to be missing such things as a floor pan, seats, cameras, antennae, battery packs, various other components, which raises a few questions, such as, where were all the other rover parts stored? How many empty equipment bays were available to accommodate all the various rover components? And how long exactly did it take the astronauts, given the limitation imposed by their suits and gloves, to deploy and fully assemble a moon buggy? GM's crafty R&D team, led by project manager Sam Romano and chief engineer Ferenc Pavlitz, supposedly came up with the innovative folding rover concept in less than a month, and in July of 1969, as Armstrong and Aldrin were allegedly taking man's first steps on the moon, GM was awarded the contract to design and build the rovers. GM quickly teamed with Boeing and got to work, with two significant challenges to overcome. The first rover must fit into the assigned bay, and the total weight was to be kept at a maximum of 400 pounds. Also, the team had to move from concept drawing to mission-ready rover in just 17 months. As with all other aspects of the Apollo program, those lofty goals proved surprisingly easy to achieve. By early 1971, GM and Boeing had already delivered their first mission-ready rover to NASA for final testing and approval. On July 31, 1971, just 2 years after the contract had been awarded, what remains to this day the only manned vehicle to allegedly land on an extraterrestrial body began kicking up moon dust. The finished product looked not unlike an Earth-based dune buggy, albeit with the unique ability to neatly fold away. The vehicle featured simultaneous front and rear steering and steel mesh tires mounted on wheels that were each driven by their own separate motors. Power was supposedly provided by an array of batteries mounted on the front end of the rover. Since no one really knew what kind of vehicle would be required to drive on the moon, early conceptual rovers ran the gamut from vehicles with massively oversized wheels to those propelled by tank-like tracks, to Archimedean screws that would be able to burrow through the lunar dust like mechanical moles. Luckily, through extensive research and development, the Apollo team was able to deduce exactly which design components would allow the rovers to operate with maximum efficiency on the lunar terrain. Or so the story goes. In reality, the rover team had obviously no time to do much at all in the way of research, development, and testing. The Soviets, on the other hand, took the development of their moon vehicle very seriously enough to spend an entire decade researching, developing, and relentlessly fine-tuning every aspect of their robotic rover. Dubbed the Lunar Code, the English translation of which is Michael Jackson, make that Moonwalker, the Soviet rover was an engineering marvel that was outfitted with an array of both still and television cameras, as well as a wide assortment of testing equipment, including X-ray spectrometer, X-ray telescope, soil testing instruments, an astrophotometer, a laser retroreflector, a fluorescence spectrometer, and a magnetometer. Lunar Code 2, deployed in January of 1973, some 37 years ago, to this day holds the record of having traversed further on an extraterrestrial body, about 23 miles, than any other robotic rover, considerably further than America's two Mars Pathfinder vehicles combined. So serious were the Soviets about testing their rover that, in the summer of 1968, they built a secret lunodrome, or a moondrome, in the remote village of Shkolnoy. Spanning some 2 acres, the moondrome featured craters up to 50 feet in diameter and fake lunar rocks of all shapes and sizes. It would have been, needless to say, an excellent place to create fake moon photos and television footage, though conventional wisdom, of course, holds that Soviet scientists and American scientists didn't play well together in those days. It's hard, though, not to conclude that NASA basically appropriated the lunar rover research done by the Soviets as their own. According to a French documentary, Tank on the Moon, the Soviets did indeed spend many long years researching all the various means of locomotion that NASA claimed to study as well. And after doing so, Russian engineers, led by Alexander Kemerjian, who NASA later consulted with on its Pathfinder project, came up with many of the same key design elements that would be utilized on NASA's lunar rovers, such as the mesh tires and the independently powered wheels. The Lunar Code vehicles had 8 wheels, each with its own independent motor, suspension, and brake. The rovers were driven by a 5-man team here on planet Earth, using panoramic images beamed back in real time to guide the robotic vehicles. The design team had developed a special lubricant that would perform in a vacuum, and they had enclosed each wheel motor in a pressurized housing. The vehicle's batteries recharged via a collection of solar cells on the inside of the craft's lid, which was kept open during the lunar day. During the frigid lunar night, the rover hibernated, kept warm by an internal radioactive heat source. Lunar Code 1 sat down on the Moon on November 17, 1970, just a few months before NASA took possession of the first mission-ready lunar rover. When that first rover allegedly arrived on the Moon 8 months later, in July of 1971, Lunar Code 1 was still traversing the lunar landscape.